So today we're going to be talking about the inciting incident and lead up. We're going to be talking about the best things that you can do to improve your inciting incident and your lead up, and what you can do in order to make appropriate amounts of tension and suspense and foreshadowing in your lead up, and also what makes an inciting event inciting enough that people actually want to keep reading. This is all related to National Novel Writing Month. Even if you're not writing a novel this month, I think that these are all valuable lessons that you can apply to when you do decide to write your novel, whenever that is. Doesn't necessarily have to be November. Alright, now as I mentioned, we're going to be talking about an inciting event first. So, the main thing that you want in your inciting event is it needs to cause change, particularly for the main character's life. For main characters, you want to have established, before the inciting event, how their life was before. So, a great example of this is Harry Potter or Hunger Games, where Harry Potter, it's very established, he lives in a cupboard under the stairs, he lives with his abusive aunt and uncle, he was dropped off there by this mysterious, seemingly wizard group that you don't know much about. So it kind of establishes what his life is like. Then, that makes it so when the inciting incident of the letters start arriving, makes it so that that change, and it's something that will change his life forever. I mean, heck, even just when the first letter arrives, his uncle starts going insane, right? And taking them off places and trying to avoid it as much as he possibly can. That is change. And then after that, it's even further change when he ends up going to the wizarding world with Hagrid. That being said, it's a great example of how the main character's life changes forever and how they adapt or don't adapt to that situation. You need to make sure that you demonstrate this form of change, because otherwise it's not an inciting incident. An inciting incident should change the main character's life forever. If it's not changing the main character's life forever, if it's just a minor thing, it's not an inciting incident, and you're going to bore your readers. It's important that you make sure to show how this is going to change their life. This is going to change how they function. This is going to change how they think. This is going to change who they make as friends. This is going to change who they consider family, possibly. For him, he thought of the Dursleys as his only family. Afterwards, you can clearly tell he thinks of the Weasleys and Hermione Granger as his found family. So it kind of changes the entire perspective. It makes it so that things are altered. Same thing with the Hunger Games. With the Hunger Games, right, it establishes that they're living pretty impoverishedly. The fact that they have to hunt for food, and that even burnt loaves of bread are good loaves of bread, and all these kinds of things establishes their impoverished lifestyle. It also establishes what the districts look like and what the government looks like. And then the inciting incident happens where her dearest little sister is called up, and she volunteers in her place to prevent her sister from having to go into the Hunger Games. This changes her entire life. She goes from being someone who's barely seen and barely noticed to being the center of attention. She's the first volunteer in a very long time. Everyone thinks of her as brave and stalwart and amazing. And yet she's just like, I'm just doing this to protect my sister. Then it also causes more change in her as a character, because she gets to see what the other half lives like. She gets to look at the Capitol and be like, I always thought the Capitol was lavish and uptight, but wow, it's even more than I thought it was. And she gets to see and feel like this celebrity because she's going to die in this gladiatorial combat. Or die, presumably. That is going to cause a drastic change in her life, right? And a drastic change in how she views herself and how other people viewed her. Before, as I said, she was a socially awkward person. If I was to pick anyone in District 12 to be, the person to start a revolution, it wouldn't be her, because she doesn't fit the role. But she changed and adapted to fit the role. And because in some ways she was awkward and didn't quite fit, that's what gave her the allure and the charisma to help bring people to her. The idea that someone as plain and normal and socially awkward as her could be this changing, driving, rebellious force. is what makes her so appealing. It's like when they start trying to do all the propaganda and whatnot later on in the series. She can't do it because she doesn't have that charisma. She just doesn't. Naturally, she doesn't have that people skills. However, her natural self is enough of a charisma to help draw people to her, even if it's awkward and not what people traditionally think should be. Alright, moving on from character change. The next thing that you need in an inciting incident, too many vowels, is questions. But specifically one question. One big question, maybe a few little ones. Now, the reason why you want questions is because this is going to draw your reader into your story. For example, with Harry Potter, why is he getting all these letters? Why are they being delivered by Owl? Who were the people at the beginning of the book that dropped him off in the first place? I want to know more. The one big question being, why are his parents dead and everyone's so secretive about it? And why is he getting, and why is, that's the main thing for the first chapter. Then later, with the letters arriving, a second, in some ways I would call it a second inciting incident, the true inciting incident, the one big question is, why are the Dursleys running from these letters? Wouldn't they beg him to leave? You know, they don't want him. They clearly don't want him. So why are they running from this opportunity to cast him out of the house? Why? It doesn't make sense. So that's a question that you ultimately get answered, and throughout the book you're able to discover why they are so afraid of this, but you're also able to discover a second big question. So hence why I said a few smaller ones, because I would say the Dursleys are one smaller one, and then I would say, I'm not going to bother with that. The Dursleys are a smaller one, and the why are there these witches and wizards are a smaller one. However, the biggest question, right, is why were his parents killed, and why is everyone so weird about his scar? Well, over the course of the first book, we discover about Lord Voldemort and all those happenings. Same thing with Hunger Games. The one big question is she going to survive the Hunger Games? That's really the big question for the first inciting event. Is she going to survive the Hunger Games, or is she going to die? Then there's a few smaller ones, like what's going on with this kind of undercoursing revolutionary idea? What's going on with the Capitol? Is anything ever going to change? So there are lots of smaller questions, but generally one big question. You don't want too many little questions and no big questions. You want one big one and a bunch of little ones. That way it helps keep, like I said, keep luring them towards that ending that you're looking for. With questions, you also want to make sure that it has to do with your world building, but also with the characters. If it just is character driven, then that's not going to be as interesting. And if it's just plot/world building driven, not going to be as interesting. If you have one that's intermingled with both world building and character building, that's going to ultimately be that perfect mix of both to be able to help draw your reader forward, to help them want to keep reading. Excuse me, I have the hiccups today. And with those questions, you want to make sure that it is a question that is not easily answered. If you have a question that is in part of the inciting event that is drawing the reader forward, you want to make sure that it is not answered in one sentence. It has to be answered over the course of the book. If your main character can go to a side character and say, so what about this big question I have? And this side character just goes, blah, 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 the end. That's not a big enough question. That's not an inciting incident. That's boring. You want to make sure that it is big enough that you have to take the time to describe it. You don't just have a random side character go, hi, info dump, random sentence, the end. Then you might as well write a children's book. If you're looking for young adult to adult fiction genre, you want to make sure it's a big question and a bunch of littler questions that take time to answer throughout the course of the novel. Alright, last thing about the inciting incident is showing a reaction to the changes given in this inciting incident. Now, I already talked a little bit about this before because you want to show that it changes the characters' lives, but the reaction is slightly different. With the reaction, it can change their lives for the better, for the worse. It can be both. I would say generally it's both. It's not just one or the other. For example, like with Harry Potter, it's good that he's able to get away from his abusive aunt and uncle, but it's bad that he's ultimately now on Voldemort's radar again, right? And with Hunger Games, it is bad that she's been put in this Hunger Games. She could potentially die, but it's good that she's saving her sister, right? There's all these complex emotions stirring up inside these characters. And with the reaction, I would say the biggest thing you want to make sure in the reaction is that A, you have complexity, like I just mentioned. But B, I would say you want to make sure that they show that they're truly reacting. If they have no reaction to something that's this life-altering and changing, they're not a real character. A lot of times people just try to force the plot upon a character, and so... Hold on a second. Hello!
Wait, the first one's here? That's a problem.
Yes, it is very surprising. I'm already in the middle of stuff, but that's okay. So, currently I'm talking about the inciting incident and what makes it more interesting. So, one thing that I was talking about is a reaction. You want to make sure that your character has a reaction to this inciting incident, and that it is A, complex, so it has good and bad to it. It's not just all perfect sunshine and roses. But you also want to make sure that I wasn't sure what you were looking for. But you also want to make sure that they have a reaction. Now, this might sound weird. It seems obvious they should have a reaction to something that's altering and changing their life drastically, but there have been several times where I have gone to edit people's stuff, even professionally, and they're like, I am following plot. I am in plot now. Yay. And you're like, this is not a character. This is a cardboard cutout. It's not really doing much. And that's okay, that's okay. This is why we have editing, so we can work through that. But you need to make sure you show the complexity of their emotions, that they're reacting to this, that they have good things about this, that they have bad things about this. You gotta make sure that that reaction is realistic too. If you were, let's say, let's do classic, damsel in distress scenario. You have, except the more common one nowadays. Hold on. Hello. Good to see you. It has been a long time. So, you want to make sure that you have a realistic reaction for your characters. So if they are, for instance, a princess who does not want to be married to a particular someone, I don't know why all the chairs are behind me. Here's a chair. No, you don't need to apologize. I was standing anyway.
I didn't see those chairs.
No, you're all good. I was standing anyway. And let's say she doesn't want to marry this prince, but her parents are like, you should. You wouldn't just have her be like, okay, and just be fine with it all of a sudden, right? You wouldn't have her be fighting it, and then all of a sudden she's totally fine with it. No. She might be totally fine with it because her parents say, if you don't, this horrible thing is going to happen. And then she's like, oh, so I guess I kind of have to do this. Or else, I don't know, a dragon's going to come destroy the town. I don't know. Come up with your own solution. But point is, the reaction needs to be realistic. They can't just be forced into the plot for no apparent reason. They need to be able to feel like they are a human being instead of just your cardboard cutout little paper doll that you nicely would. This is true, but even then they would have realistic reactions. Alright, so the next thing we're going to talk about after the inciting event is the lead up. So, the first thing you want is a general idea of what your climax is going to be. So even though we're not going to be talking about writing the climax today, you want a general idea of what your climax is going to be. Even if you're not a plotter and you prefer to just write and just figure it out when you get there, you need a general idea. It doesn't have to be like, and this happens, and this happens, and this happens. It can just be like, I know that at some point it's revealed that her father is really alive. You don't really know how it happens or why it happens. You just know that's what the climax is. And that's okay. You don't have to know specifics, but at least a general idea, at least a vague silhouette of an idea of the climax. The reason why is because this general idea of the climax slash ending is going to help guide your writing for the lead up. And again, there are editors for a reason. You don't have to do it perfectly. These are just recommendations. But I would say having that general idea definitely helps lead your writing in the right direction, so that way you have less editing to do later. Now, to be fair, there are lots of writers that don't do this. Brandon Sanderson actually admits to being one of them. He generally has no idea what the ending slash climax is going to be, except a very, very, very vague silhouette, to the point where he says he doesn't even bother to add foreshadowing, which we're going to talk about in a minute, until after he finishes the book, because he doesn't know how to foreshadow until he knows what it looks like. And as you can probably tell, his foreshadowing is always phenomenal, but that's because he does it in post. So, my point is we're going to be talking about foreshadowing today, but don't assume that your foreshadowing is going to be perfect, because usually it takes many rounds of editing and looking at it in post to really flesh that out for you. Speaking of which, foreshadowing. Okay. Now this is a personal opinion, so other people may disagree with me, but I personally find this has been the typical ratio. Now it's not constant, tried and true, but I would say this is a good ratio to aim for, and then if you have a little more, a little less, you're fine. But this is a good ratio to aim for. I typically give my advice when I do foreshadowing with my editing clients of 2 blunt foreshadows. So it's like almost smacking them in the face, but not quite. You almost have this moment of like, where you're kind of teasing the reader a little obviously, like it almost feels like a slap in the face, but then you pull back at the last second and you're like, I'm just kidding. And then you have a bunch of little ones.
The man left the room without
So-
trying to count all of the
So with the 2 blunt ones, like I said, you want to make sure you don't make it too blunt. If you actually smack them in the face, they'll probably figure it out. But if you just are kind of like, ha, I'm just kidding, then they might not figure it out, right? But when they look at it in post, they're like, oh, that's so obvious. But that's because you come close, but then you pull back at the last second for these 2 blunt foreshadows. But then you have a bunch of little foreshadows. You need to make sure that you have, so the reason I say this is because when you outline a story, right, you have your classic beginning, your ending, and your middle. Now, if you have a blunt foreshadow about here and a blunt foreshadow about here, that means when they get to this ending, they'll remember it. If you have just one blunt foreshadow at the beginning, by the time they get to this ending, they're going to forget it. Or if you have one blunt foreshadow here by the ending, then they're going to be confused why they didn't give it to you at the beginning. Which is why I say typically 2 is a good number. If you do more than 2 blunt foreshadows, it can sometimes feel a little bit like you're hitting the reader over the head with a stick. You're like, get the foreshadowing! And they're like, okay! And they kind of cry in the corner. But yes, question.
You need a, trying to think how to say this,
That's okay.
a reason for foreshadow. Like, for example, in Brandon Sanderson's in Trust of the Emerald Sea, you have the whole thing with, I'm not gonna spoil it.
But there's
No, no, no,
foreshadowing.
The whole thing with,
Yeah.
you know exactly what. But there's a reason for that, right? Like, it's like, do you ever put in foreshadowing without a reason behind it?
That is an excellent question. So I actually have this on here as well. So you also want to have relevance. So that I believe that is kind of what you're talking about, is where it needs to be relevant to the plot. You can't just have it be for no reason. You are correct. So for example, a lot of cliche books tend to do this, where it's like, I feel like there's danger. And it's like, why? You technically don't know about the danger, so why are you feeling there's danger? That doesn't make sense. Whereas if it's relevant, if they're like, I don't know, the spiders in the Harry Potter series, where they, the spiders are skittering out of the Hogwarts, and everyone's like, that's kind of weird, right? It's relevant because basilisks scare spiders, right? And so it's relevant. If they just had the spiders running away and then we're like, spiders running away. that, like you said, it is a problem there. I agree with you. Thank you for pointing that out. Relevance is incredibly important, that you make sure it's relevant.
So, can you do, so you shouldn't do stuff like, I'm trying to think, you know what I mean, like, okay.
No, yeah, like a great example of this in a lot of, it's technically a fan fiction trope, but they also do it in some more cheesy novels, is like their eyes change color when they're around a specific thing, like a werewolf or something. That's unrelated. It doesn't really work, especially because they never really explain it. It just kind of is. It's like, but why do their eyes change color around werewolves? And it's like, they just do. That's not relevant enough. Now, if their eyes change color around werewolves because they've evolved to hunt werewolves, there's a reason for their eyes to change color. You need to make sure it has some sort of plot relevancy.
Yeah, no. Their eyes change color because of where, around werewolves, because they once saw a werewolf and they're just like, spooky.
Spooky. Now werewolves. Yeah, no. See, this is why I thank you. I appreciate that you bringing it up, Charlie. Right? Yeah. Yeah. With the relevance, because relevance is incredibly important. With your foreshadows, you want to make sure you have two blunt ones, and that they have a reason for it and a relevance for it. You also want to make sure you have a bunch of little ones. However, with your foreshadowing, you don't necessarily have to have the characters even do it. Like with the spiders in Harry Potter. That wasn't the characters doing something, that was just them observing something odd, right? Or you can have other things like your classic murder mystery. You might have a gun sitting on the mantelpiece, and no one thinks anything of the gun, and then they're like, oh my gosh, the gun is the key to the whole thing, you know? So that's foreshadowing, but it's relevant because it relates to the murder. Does that make sense?
They kicked the bloody knife around the floor. They thought it was ketchup because of all they did in front of the ketchup. And so they thought that it had nothing to do with it, but it turns out that
See,
they
there you go.
murdered 7 people.
You never know. You never know as far as with
Your
foreshadowing.
obsession with blood versus ketchup has gone like way over the top. We need to find new material. Yes, do. It's
Black and
too
white,
orange
black and
stupid.
white movie and chocolate syrup. There you go. Because that is what they used in black and white movies. Anyway, so with foreshadowing, I would say the two blunt is important because then you have one slightly after the ending, but before the middle, slightly after the beginning, pardon me, but before the middle, and then one just before the ending, but after the middle. That way they keep it reminded that something weird is going on, right? I had this one recently, I'm not going to spoil it for you, but basically there was this big event at the very end, and she's leading up to it the whole time, and there's two events that really make you kind of go, that was weird, and it kind of doesn't make sense, and then a bunch of little things where it's like, whatever, you don't think anything of it, but then when you reread it, you're like, oh my gosh, it all makes sense, and that's kind of what you want. You want two blunt ones where the person goes, that's weird, and then you want a bunch of little ones that people just generally gloss over. Your readers will generally think like, whatever, that doesn't even, it's not relevant. You want them to think it's not relevant, but then when you do the reveal, they're like, oh my gosh, it was all relevant.
What if you have
So-
your own non-relevant little like Easter, like?
I would say,
foreshadowing
okay,
things
Easter
for,
eggs
like-
are a different thing.
Yeah, that's
Let
what
me
I call red herring.
Let me address, I was gonna say, there's red herrings, which is important. However, if you do the red herring, I would say don't either make it obvious that it's a red herring, where you're like, boom, this is a thing, and they're like, it seems obvious, and then it's not. One of my favorite examples, I think we've talked about this before though, is there was this murder mystery show where the guy is running home, and he's like, I gotta get home, and it seems like weird. And then you learn that someone dies by werewolf attack, and you're like, oh, it was clearly him. Psych, he was running to get home because his mom is the werewolf. And so as a result, it's one of those red herrings that you're like, it seems relevant at the time, but then when you do the reveal, you're like, oh, it still makes sense. So I would say it still has to make sense if you're doing a red herring, but make sure that it also makes sense in the opposite direction. It could go either way.
What happens if like you do something like that, but you make it like connected to a different series?
I would say if you're going to do different series connection, you've got to make sure that it's very vague. For example, I had someone I worked with recently who was doing a retelling series of a bunch of different fairy tales, and she had someone randomly say, yeah, I kissed a girl who I thought was dead in the woods once. Turns out she wasn't dead. Snow White, And so like
That's so blunt.
it seems so well, yeah, but it also seems so random though, right? You're just like, that's so random. Why would you mention that you kissed a dead girl? That's
Or else,
random.
like, if it's a bunch of friends around a campfire saying, like, what's your, like, secret that you're having for anyone?
Exactly.
And that makes sense.
It was them. It was a bunch of. It was the three brothers. They were three brother princes, and the one guy was getting berated because he was dating this girl that was Cinderella, and they were like, "You're not even the weirdest one. Like, calm down." And so it kind of seemed less blunt because they were all just sharing weird stories about random girls they courted, and so it seemed less weird. But it was kind of an Easter egg to say, hey, this guy's going to be involved in the next book, kind of a thing. So yeah, if you're going to have it be relevant to the series or to a different series, I would say make sure that you either have that series already published or that it's vague. That you're kind of like, okay, that's weird, and then you move on, and then later you're like, oh, for example, Marissa Meyer's Cindered is a great example of that. Did you know that every character that is utilized as a main character in the Cinder series is either referenced or shows up in the first book? It's insane. It's really crazy. When I read it the first time, I was like, K random person, K random thing mentioned, K random person. Then I reread it because I had to read a dystopian book for an English class, and I did it. And yeah, no, seriously, Wolf is mentioned temporarily. Cress shows up digitally. Winter is also mentioned temporarily and slightly has a caveat of a show up. Jason also shows up. Thorn also is briefly mentioned. They're all briefly mentioned or show up within that first book. It's kind of wild. You don't even notice it because it's so slick. She did it so well. So I would say if you're doing it for the rest of the series or another series, make sure that you kind of slide it in there and it feels natural, but then when they reread it, they're like, oh wait, I see you.
I could have like a neighboring series like in the same like universe or something.
No, yeah, or
And
like,
then like a secondary character that just ties it all together.
yes, exactly. You can absolutely have stuff like that if you want to do Easter eggs. Or like I have a particular character that shows up in every single one of my short stories, but you always know, if you were to read all my short stories, you'd know it's him because his name's Birch. And so you're just like, oh wait, it's that guy.
You pretty much have like a Hoyt for your
Yeah, he's pretty much just the interdimensional, hi, I'm here, goodbye. He's the random side
same.
character that just fills.
You have your own Hoyt?
It's great, it makes me happy. Anyway,
That's
So-
nice, actually. I love that.
thanks. So, anyway, moving forward. So, let me scroll to make sure that I have the rest. Okay. All right. Okay. The next thing we're going to talk about is relationships and downtime. Now, when I say relationships, it doesn't mean always romantic. This can be friendships. This can be random mentorship. This can be a father-like figure or a mother-like figure, or even their actual mother figure or father figure. You need to make sure you establish relationships as well. Everyone has some sort of relationship, even the lone wolves, right? People claim to be lonely and be lone wolves, but let's be real here. Even if you are alone, you still have relationships with other people, whether it's through online, whether it's in person, whether it's someone calls you once a week, whether it's they visit you once a month or every week. Everyone has some sort of a relationship.
Or just the dude at the checkout who's like the
Yeah.
one person you can tolerate in this entire society.
Right, exactly. You
Or
could just,
your
if you're talking about the
therapist.
cashier or your therapist, these are all
I do one of
relationships.
those.
These are all relationships,
No,
though. I feel like everyone does,
My
but
question.
so with relationships, it doesn't necessarily have to be romantic. I want to clarify that. And you need to make sure they also have downtime, even if you are dealing with a crazy murder mystery or a fantasy universe or a science fiction high-speed chase. You need to have some downtime to develop these relationships. Why? Because of the fact that that's what it's going to make your characters feel more human, feel more real. Whether the lone wolves like to admit it or not, we are a society that relies on human contact. I mean, heck, there have even been experiments done on it where small children that are left alone for long periods of time have serious psychological damage because of the fact that you cannot be alone for that long. You have to have some sort of connection, even if it's a small connection. Even if it's just you say hi to your neighbor every morning. You know, it needs to be some sort of connection. Or even if it's you go see your brother, and even if you don't like your brother, you still have a relationship. It's something. And you need to make sure you show that in the character's downtime. Because let's all be real here. Even if you're being chased by a crazy fantasy villain, you want to live your own normal life sometimes, right? Don't we all have times where we're like, oh my gosh, life sucks right now and I just want it to be normal? Yeah, we all do. What is normal, first of all, but at the same time, we all have that draw towards wanting normality, right? Especially if your life is so abnormal. You want it to be regular. You want everything to go right. You want everything to just calm down for a second, right? And so having that downtime, even if it's a forced downtime, even if it's like, hey, they are being chased by this villain, but they know for a fact that the villain can't get into this particular village because of some sort of incantation. That makes it so that when they stay in that village, they're like, oh my gosh, I can recuperate, I can breathe. Hey, maybe I'll even sit down and share a meal with this one character who I really want to befriend, but I'm too scared. You know? That helps build the relationships, and it helps you feel the building of your own character. It helps make sure that your own main character is able to stand on their own 2 feet by themselves. Why is this hard? Because we like writing the action, right? It's so much more fun to write stabby stab, running, car chase, crash. You know, that's so much more exciting for us because we're not dealing with it, right? Whereas if we were actually dealing with it, don't you think you'd want some downtime? Some time to relax? Some time to chill out? Be yourself?
No.
Not have to worry about dying all the time? So that's why downtime is important with your main characters. So that way you can help really develop who they are and what they value and what matters to them. And it also helps make sure that those relationships are well nurtured. If all they're doing is running away all the time, you also got to show these relationships if you don't have downtime. I will say, if you decide no downtime, this is really hard to do, but you have to show how that relationship is suffering from no downtime. You have to demonstrate, well, they were dating and they had a great relationship, or they were friends and had a great relationship, but they've been running away from this villain for so long that it is literally shattering what relationship they had, because they don't have a chance to nurture it. Now, there is something to be said for what's called trauma bonding. We're going to touch on that real quick, where there is something like that, where if you both experience trauma together, it can actually unite you if you let it. Now, that's why I say if you let it, is because with relationships, if you are just having trauma, and you aren't dealing with it in a healthy, good way, that's not trauma bonding. That's trauma shattering. Trauma can either shatter or bond someone together, and it's up to the characters. You want to make sure that you show that relationship not having downtime has its effects, but you also want to show the fact that that relationship can be built up or broken down by how they deal with trauma together. Because they are going to be dealing with a lot of trauma if you're dealing with fantasy villains and sci-fi car chases and all these kinds of things, right? And you want to show the fact that this trauma can either build you up or break you down. And everyone handles it slightly differently. I would say, if you haven't already, think about in the future taking some sort of beginner psychology course. Because it's really beneficial to learn the psychology of other people, so that way when you're writing your characters, you can apply that same psychology. I would say the biggest thing is, if you're going to do a trauma bonding, you need to show how they are working through that trauma in a healthy way together. Whereas if you're going to do the trauma shatters their relationship, you need to show how unhealthy that relationship is becoming because of it. Are they blaming each other for the trauma that happened? Are they refusing to talk about the trauma that happened? Are they, like Ron and Harry, saying you kept a secret from me and not trusting each other like they always have before? That's going to show this shattering of a relationship. Whereas a building of relationship is going to show they're confiding in each other, they're trusting each other, they're talking about it, They're making sure to say, hey, I don't know what to do about this. Even if it's I don't know what to do and the other person says I don't know too, they can then cry about it together, right? This is going to help show them healing from their trauma together. Does that make sense? Okay. A lot of people like to just blame romance and things like that on trauma bonding, but then they don't do it right, which is why I feel the need to cover this. So, alright, next thing is, alright, so we already kind of talked about this with the inciting incident, but it's even more important with lead up. They need to stay true to themselves. You need to make sure that if they are the type of person who absolutely loves to be cheerful and happy all the time, that you show either how they slowly lose that, or how they're still trying in spite of the fact that they're being chased by evil bad guys that are trying to murder them. And those are two very different reactions that people definitely have. There are some people who are so positive and happy-go-lucky that they can't get rid of it, even when it would be healthier to deal with the negative emotions. That is actually an unhealthy response. There's all sorts of things you could do with that. So we're just going to go with the happy-go-lucky idea. So, you can either have the character stay happy to a toxic level, to the point where it's like, you should actually deal with the fact that your friend just died. And they're like, nope, have to look on the positive side. I'll be fine. I twitch. And you're like, bro, you're gonna explode. Or you deal with them turning into a pessimist, and they lose that. Let's say the same example, their friend died. They could go from being this happy-go-lucky person to being like, well, clearly me being happy didn't fix anything, so now I'm just going to be negative. They can just go the opposite direction. Or they can try to be happy-go-lucky and then ultimately have a healthy moment of breakdown, where it's like, I'm fine, I promise I'm fine, and then all of a sudden a friend is like, are you okay? And they're like, no, not okay. So these are all different ways that you can deal with that same idea. But what you don't want to do is have it be like, I am a happy-go-lucky person, and then their friend dies, and they don't notice. Nothing changes. Exactly, they don't notice. I am still happy-go-lucky, everything is fine, yay. It's like, no one would do that. I'm sorry. I consider myself a generally happy person, and every time someone or something dies in my life, I'm sad about it, okay? That's a healthy, normal thing to be sad about losing people and losing pets and losing things, and it's normal, okay? And it's healthy and it's good. So I would say generally, if you have a trait that your character has, make sure that you continue to have them have that trait. And make sure that it makes realistic sense with what a person would actually do. You also want to make sure that you describe it in the right way. Now, the reason I say describe it in the right way is because I recently ran across something that I was reading in my creative writing class, won't say names, but I was doing peer reviews for my creative writing class, and I ran across something where I'm like, I think this is what they're going for, but this is what it sounds like, and those are not the same thing. Basically, the idea was they had a super sleuth kind of character, Sherlock Holmes type of character. Except they were trying to do the I'm so grizzled and hardened by trauma that I refuse to, engage in emotion. It's all logic. And they were trying to go for that. Except the way they described it sounded like they were going psychotic. And I'm like, this is a problem. You don't want us to think that the Sherlock Holmes character is now a serial killer. Because that's how they described it. They described it as I have no emotions now. And I'm like, that's not how that works. Sure, shutting off your emotions and having problems with your emotions, absolutely, 100%. But just being I have no emotions now, forever, I is robot. Yeah, no, that is called psychosis. Please seek help. This is a problem. So, it's also about staying true to the character in the way you describe them. Make sure that you have a beta reader or several read it and then be like, oh my gosh, okay, this is not the right vibe. Here's your vibe. Here's the vibe I'm getting. And you need to make sure that you have someone who's willing to tell you that too. You gotta make sure it's not just the people who say, it's perfect. It's probably not.
Now I want to write some where Sherlock Holmes just turns total serial killer.
Wait, just stab everyone.
I started by solving crimes and now I'm doing.
And now I am the crime.
Now I am the crime. I am the crime. The ultimate crime, yes. Exactly. I'm like, okay, this is a problem.
Because anybody that even looks at me, I will literally shoot down everybody.
Just nope. Evil, clearly. I can see it in your eyes. But yeah, no, so there's a little bit of a problem here. Granted, there's also ways that you can try to do this and go a little overboard, right? Where you're like, they feel no emotions to the point where you're like, they literally feel no emotions. No, that's again psychosis.
Yeah, it's like,
Where,
like,
that's called
I found
psychosis.
the bad guy.
Whereas if you actually are it's normal to feel emotions, even if you want to shut out those emotions. We all have moments probably where we're like, nope, don't want to feel that. Kloof. And so we shut it off, right? But you gotta show the character shutting it off. You gotta show that the character's like, oh my gosh, I feel sympathy for them. Nope, the last time I felt sympathy for a person like that, I got stabbed. Will not do that. That's different. That feels more organic, more natural, more human, and less serial killer. So,
Sherlock Holmes is a serial killer.
that'd be wild. Anyway.
That would be really weird. Oh. Wow.
Yeah, it's just like from solving the crimes to creating the crimes.
Not a bad story idea. I think I know it's already been used, but you know.
Alright.
Well, I'm not the Sherlock Holmes.
But yes, so character solution. Now, what does this mean? I'm referring to the ending / climax now. However, this is the lead up. This is important. So for example, I'm just going to use superheroes as a great example. Let's say we have a villain who wants to murder everyone. What would Captain America probably do in this scenario? Put him in jail. However, if we're dealing with someone who wants to murder everyone, and we're dealing with Tony Stark, what would he do? Probably stab him.
Probably.
These are very drastically
Stark
different
is my
directions.
favorite.
But see, these are different directions of a character, right? So it's important that you have this character acknowledge what solutions they want to take before they get there. You want to make sure that you're not having your character be like, I'm so hardened and grizzled, I will totally kill the villain. And then at the last second, they're like, no, bro, jail. that just feels like
Unless we have them change over the story and get
Right,
like, gradually
right.
softer.
Oh,
Because I can
yes.
actually see that being really cool.
Exactly. See, you gotta show that though. You gotta
Yeah,
make sure you
absolutely.
demonstrate it.
Oh.
So yes, exactly. That is a great,
Or
perfect
something
example.
like, like you know, like they never tell somebody, or like they're like, I want to kill somebody because somebody killed my mom, and then like they're about to kill somebody, and I'm like, okay, wait, my mom died.
Well, see, but there you go. You gotta show different examples of that. You can't just have them suddenly bail on it at the last minute. If you're gonna have them bail on it at the last minute, you gotta foreshadow it. You gotta foreshadow the fact that they're like, I can't wait to kill him for revenge. And then all of a sudden, they think about killing them, and they're like, I'll get there when I get there. You know, they shut it off again. They're like, I'll deal with it when I get there. However, if they're actively thinking about killing that person to get vengeance all the time, and then they suddenly put them in jail, that doesn't vibe right. That crisscrosses. That doesn't work. So you gotta make sure you're foreshadowing what the solution is gonna look like. You gotta make sure you know what your character's like. The reason I say this is because a lot of people actually ask me, should I have my character kill the villain? That's not up to me. That is not my choice. That is your character's choice. It's not your choice either, ultimately. It's your character's choice. If you write your character in a Captain America-like way, absolutely not. Make sure that they put them in jail. If you write them in an Iron Man-like way, make sure they stab them. You gotta make sure that their vibe fits with what their actions are, what they're ultimately going to do. Or if they want to kill them really, really badly, but they also don't have the heart to pull the trigger, that's another one that you can foreshadow well. You just gotta make sure that you demonstrate these character solutions before the solution. That way you don't have a disconnect with your reader. Alright. Any other questions about leading up to the climax or the inciting incident? No? Okay. Don't forget that we have a first chapter contest going on this month. All entries are due on the 30th of November. Make sure that it's between 1,500 and 3,000 words. If it's less than 1,500, I will not take it. If it's more than 3,000, I also unfortunately cannot take it. I know I did 6,000 for my last contest, but all my coworkers said that was too much. So unfortunately, I'm going with 3,000 this time. Just remember, it's the first chapter. You don't necessarily have to end like in the middle of a sentence though. Please try to end it at semi-ending, even if your chapter is longer than 3,000 words, or maybe try to find ways to cut it down. I'd be more than happy to help you edit it. Just know if I edit it, that also means I can't grade it. So just be aware of that. But hey, if I edit it, it also probably means you're likely to get a higher score even from my coworkers. So, that being said, I always mix them up anyway. I never read the titles, I just rip them all off and then I scramble them all up. So I never know who's anyway, but I try to make sure if I have edited it that I don't do it, because then I'll recognize it when I reread it most of the time. Anyway, so please make sure that you know about that. And next month, actually something to look forward to, we will be doing a cozy mystery short story writing contest. So if you're looking forward to that, know that that'll start on December 1st and be due by December 30th as well. Okay.